If there's one thing people on the internet love to argue about, it's Snap-on versus Harbor Freight. Some of that has been fueled by Harbor Freight ads that specifically target Snap-on. For example, there's one where Harbor Freight puts their Earthquake XT impact wrench up against the Snap-on MG725. So today, we're going to put that to the test. I'm going to tear apart this Snap-on MG725 impact wrench, and we're going to compare the internals to the Harbor Freight Earthquake XT impact that I tore apart in another video. First up, the cosmetics. The Snap-on MG725 is not surprisingly magnesium, so all this is cast magnesium. Then we have what appears to be a nitrile rubber grip, as well as a nitrile rubber pad on the top of the impact. On the casting, all the markings are well formed, the letters are sharp, everything looks good as far as that goes. This is heavier than the Harbor Freight impact, not surprisingly. The Harbor Freight has a plastic housing. It's not a huge weight difference, but you know, back in my shop days, I'd be using an impact wrench for hours on end, so lighter was always better. It looks like if I remove these 4 torque screws on the back, we should be able to remove the rear cover plate and pull out the internals. It turns out the rear cover doesn't come off quite that easily. It's held on by the cap here on the back of the reversing lever. Here we have the rear cover plate, and check out what a complex casting this is, with all the webbing and everything for reinforcement, and it all looks really nicely done. There's pretty much no casting flash. I don't see any voids or other problems. It looks good and it's nicely finished. There is nothing wrong with this. However, it would be nice to see a better material for the rear gasket here. This is paper. It would be nice if they used rubber or plastic, something that would be less likely to tear if you open this up to service it. Let's see if we can start getting this impact wrench apart. Oh, we have oil. We're leaking oil. Now we have all the parts out of the impact here, and they look on first blush a lot like what you'd see in any impact wrench of this type of design. We have the rear end plate here, the cylinder here, the rotor vanes, the front end plate, and of course the hammer mechanism. There are a couple interesting features on this that we'll get into, the first of which is how they control the air on this. This is the reversing lever here that controls which direction the impact turns. And when you're pushing this lever back and forth, what you're doing is rerouting the air. And that's what these 2 O-rings on the cylinder do. When you have the lever one way, air flows up here on this side, and that turns the rotor one way. If you push the lever the other way, air flows up through this side of the cylinder and makes the rotor turn the opposite direction. The hammer mechanism on this is lubricated with oil, and that's what this O-ring is for here on the front end plate. What it does is keep that lubricant in the front half of the impact where the hammer mechanism is. That's something we've seen on some other impacts I've torn down, for example, the Chicago Pneumatic CP734H. But one thing this impact is lacking is an easy way to change that oil. On the Chicago Pneumatic, there's a port with a little plug. You can take out the plug, drain out the oil, and add new oil. I don't see any way on this impact to change the oil in the hammer mechanism without taking it apart like I just did here. Here we have the insides from the Snap-on, and here we have the insides from the Harbor Freight. We can see right off the bat there are some differences. Now we're going to go through part by part and see how the 2 compare. Here we have the air cylinder assemblies, and we can see some differences right off the bat. The Snap-on has separate front and rear end plates, and then of course the cylinder, whereas on the Harbor Freight it's much more of an integrated assembly. The cylinder and the rear end plate, well, there really isn't a rear end plate because the cylinder in the back here is all a single piece of aluminum which is cast and then machined into the final shape. And you can see this is the reversing assembly here, which is a separate part that's held on the bottom with a couple screws. If you watched my other video where I tore down the Harbor Freight impact, you know that the machine work on all these parts is very nicely done and very cleanly done. And it is as well on the Snap-on. Everything looks good here on the end plates and on the cylinder. And I think there are a couple features on the Snap-on which might give it a little more longevity. Here's the rear end plate. And something interesting you notice is there's 2 pieces here. This is aluminum and this is steel. And I think that's because one of the ways impact wrenches can wear out is the rotor wears through the end plate here. You no longer have a good seal and the impact loses a lot of power. So what we have here is we have a steel end plate here that's sandwiched between them. That will make it a lot longer lasting, I suspect. On the Harbor Freight, the rotor, of course, is also steel, but both end plates are aluminum. The front one, which we'll look at later, is aluminum, and the rear part of the cylinder here is aluminum. So if there's going to be wear developing, it'll wear through that quicker than it would through this steel end plate. Let's take a look now at the rotor vanes, and we can see here the Snap-on one is much larger, and there are more of them. The Snap-on uses 8 vanes. The Harbor Freight has 6, which is pretty normal, although I've also seen 7. Using larger rotor vanes is one strategy for getting more power because it's simply more surface area for the compressed air to push against, equaling more torque. Snap-on also says that having more and larger rotor vanes lets the impact spin up to full speed faster. You can see they're both phenolic resin, the same material for the vanes, which I'm a little bit surprised to see because I've taken apart a decent number of impacts, and usually higher-end impact wrenches I've seen use plastic rotor vanes. Someone commented on one of my past videos and said plastic rotor vanes might need less lubrication than phenolic resin, but phenolic resin might last longer. So here we have the rotors from both impacts. The machine work and the build quality is slightly better on the Snap-on. There's nothing wrong with the Harbor Freight, but the work is just a little better on the Snap-on. We can see on the front of the shaft here, the shaft is actually bigger on the Snap-on than it is on the Harbor Freight. It might be hard to tell in the video, but the splines are more cleanly cut here on the Snap-on than they are on the Harbor Freight. This little ridge here on the Snap-on is from a nice feature. There's another rubber seal behind the front bearing, which also helps keep the oil in the hammer mechanism. It's time to talk about one of my very favorite topics, bearings. Here we have the rear bearings out of the Harbor Freight over here and the Snap-on over here. These are both open bearings, which is normal in an air tool. These are lubricated by whatever oil you put into the air supply. On the Harbor Freight here, I think we might have a slight edge because we can see the size, 6001. It's a larger bearing than the Snap-on. And we also have the markings Taiwan and TPI. TPI is the bearing maker. They're a bearing company in Taiwan that appears to be a pretty reputable company. They claim to be the largest bearing maker in Taiwan. As you probably know, Taiwanese products are often good quality, so I have no qualms at all about this bearing. I was expecting to see a top shelf bearing in the Snap-on, but that's not what I found. Here we have the markings R6, that's the size, China, the country of origin, and AST. AST is a bearing supplier. They source bearings from makers all over the world and supply them to manufacturers, in this case like Snap-on, and to wholesalers. So here we have no manufacturer name, but we can see this is made in China, which is not super encouraging. I'm sure Snap-on did not source a subpar bearing, but it would be nice if we had a name brand bearing here. Since I bought this used, I should say, in theory, someone could have replaced the bearings in this, but I doubt that. I suspect these are the original bearings. Looking at the front motor end plates here on the Harbor Freight, you know, nothing special. Very nice machine work. We have another bearing there, of course, in the front. It's also an open bearing. This is lubricated with the grease in the hammer mechanism, and on the Snap-on, it's lubricated with the oil in the hammer mechanism. The Snap-on also has, again, a steel wearing plate that will protect the aluminum end plate from excessive wear. Here's the hammering mechanism out of the Snap-on. It's your basic twin hammer mechanism that we see used in all kinds of different brands of impact wrenches. We'll take it apart here and compare it to the Harbor Freight. Here we have the two hammering mechanisms. This is the Snap-on over here, and we have the Harbor Freight over here. You can see they're very similar because they are both patterned on the same classic twin hammer impacting mechanism. But there are a couple interesting differences that I wasn't exactly expecting. Looking at the anvils here themselves, they're both very well made, but there are a couple just production differences. The Snap-on has been turned, so there are machining marks here going side to side because it was turned in a lathe. Whereas on the Harbor Freight, you can see this surface all looks smooth as it does here. That's just because it was ground, a slightly different production process that leaves a little bit smoother finish. Here we have a couple of the real business parts, the hammers from the hammering mechanism. This is the Snap-on over here. The Snap-on is a little bigger and a little heavier. I weighed them. The Snap-on hammers are 118 grams each, and the Harbor Freight hammers are 105 grams each. So you just have more mass on the Snap-on doing the hitting, the actual impacting. Another detail I was not expecting to see is, check this out. They took the time to put a nicer finish on the Snap-on hammer. It looks to me like, as a final step, they ran it through a vibratory polisher, probably, where, you know, they run it through a machine, it vibrates with abrasive media to give it a significantly smoother finish. It's interesting they took the time and expense to do that on a part you'd basically never see unless you took the impact wrench apart. Here are the hammer cages out of the two impacts. And there's one thing on the Snap-on here that I haven't ever seen on an impact wrench I've taken apart before. Check out these two rough spots. It appears what happens is when they make the hammer cage here, at the end of the production process, they're left with two nubs, and it looks like they just snap them off, leaving these kind of rough spots. I have not seen that before, like I mentioned, on any impact wrench I've taken apart. Looking down inside the Snap-on's magnesium housing here, and everything is pretty well made, and this is a pretty detailed piece. We have this ridge here that the front end plate rests against. The seal that holds the oil inside the front half of the case rests right around here. And we have these two little lips here. And these are for the O-rings on the cylinder that, if you remember from before, control where the air flows and the direction that the impact actually turns. Overall, this is all well done. Looking inside the Harbor Freight here, it's a lot simpler just because it's a different type of design. So we have the air motor and the reversing mechanism and everything, much more of a self-contained unit that just kind of slips down here inside the composite housing. This is nicely detailed and nicely made, but it's just overall a simpler piece because of the different designs they use between the Harbor Freight and the Snap-on. If you've watched some of the other videos about these impact wrenches, for example, the test done by the guy over at Real Tool Reviews, then you know that both of these impact wrenches are pretty powerful. Well, now that we've torn them apart and looked at the insides, what have we learned? Well, the Snap-on does have a couple features, in my opinion, that might improve the longevity over the Harbor Freight. For example, the steel plates in the air motor. But the Snap-on is heavier, and ideally I would like to see an easier way to change the lubricant in the hammer mechanism, and maybe a rubber gasket here on the rear end plate. There is also a difference in the country of origin that I forgot to mention earlier. The Earthquake XT impact wrench is made in Taiwan. The Snap-on impact is built in the USA, but as we saw in the bearings, not every part of it comes from the USA. Overall, I would have to say both of these are well made. I can see reasons why you might want to choose each one. But the Snap-on does have a couple features that might give it a leg up over the Harbor Freight, and there are one or two spots where the machine work is better on the Snap-on. But then again, the Snap-on does cost a lot more money. So what do you think? Which one of these would you choose? Hit the like button if you like this video, subscribe so you can see my new videos when they come out, and thanks for watching.